All right, these are the notes for Chapter 2, Section 3. That should be the heading of these notes. I will go ahead and let you know these notes are a little lengthier than notes that we've taken in the past. So let's go ahead and get started. This section is all about the Articles of Confederation and the forming of a new government. So here are just some leading questions. Some key terms: Articles of Confederation. You will want to know that, what that is. You do not have to write it down because you can always look it up if necessary. But the Articles of Confederation was essentially kind of like the first Constitution of the United States. And ratification is to formally approve a proposal. All right, so this was your focus question for Section 3 that you should have answered on the discussion board: the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation that made a lasting government impossible. Here are some of the answers you could have written. Congress lacked key powers. It could not raise taxes or regulate trade. The Congress could not make states obey the laws it passed. 9 out of the 13 states had to agree before Congress could act. And the articles could only be changed with the consent of all 13 states. So all 13 state legislators had to agree before anything could be changed. So those are some of the reasons the Articles of Confederation could not last as the lasting constitution or document for the United States. So your first heading is Articles of Confederation. So last time we talked about the Continental Congresses. So at the Second Continental Congress, they had to create an official national government. And at that time, during the Second Continental Congress, Congress approved the Articles of Confederation in 1777. They were not ratified until 1781, meaning they weren't approved until 1781. What was important about it was that the Articles created a single unit of government. So even though we declared independence already and we're in the midst of the Revolutionary War, we still have not won the Revolutionary War yet. That's the time frame kind of that we're in right now. So during this time, Congress was unicameral, which meant that it only had one house. Now we're bicameral. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate, but at this time there was only one house. That was the way it was structured, and each state elected delegates every year. So there was election every year to elect people to Congress. And then each state had one vote. So your next heading will be federal government. So at this time, the national government had no executive or judicial branch. They only had Congress. And remember, the Congress only had one house. They did not have two at that time. Special congressional committees exercise executive and judicial functions, but the executive and judicial branch did not exist. Something else that's interesting during this time was that each year Congress would elect a president of the Congress, not the nation. So there still wasn't a president of the United States. The Congress, the people in Congress, would elect a president of Congress. The people did not vote for that person. The delegates or the legislators in Congress voted for that president of Congress. So at this point, what powers did Congress hold under the Articles of Confederation? What could they do? So your next heading is Congress. What could Congress do during this time? Well, there were a few things they could do. They could make war, and they could make peace. They could make treaties and handle ambassadors. They could borrow money, and they could set up a money system. They could build a navy. They could raise an army. They could set standards of weights and measures. And then one of their big jobs was to settle disputes between the states, because the states did not always get along. So Congress would step in to settle any disputes amongst the states. So your next heading, states under the Articles. So this is what the states said they would do under the Articles. This is what they promised to do. So under the Articles, the states will obey the Articles and the acts of Congress. They would provide funds and troops if requested by Congress. They would treat citizens of other states fairly. They would respect the laws and court rulings of the other states. They would have open travel and trade with other states. They would submit interstate disputes to Congress, meaning if there was a problem between Georgia and Virginia, they would submit that dispute to Congress for Congress to look at and to settle. And then the last thing that the states promised to do was to turn over fugitives from other states, meaning if I was arrested and convicted of a crime in North Carolina, I could not go to Virginia and live there. If Virginia found out that I was there, they would have to give me back to North Carolina. So under the Articles of Confederation, the states kept all the powers. Congress had power, but the states had more power. So back to the focus question, the weaknesses of the Articles. So the question is, why were they weak? Why do we not still have the Articles of Confederation today? Well, it's because these are some of the reasons why. There was only a firm league of friendship among the states, meaning like they gave their word. There wasn't anything that tied them or bonded them to keeping their word. Only one vote for each state, regardless of the size. So a bigger state only had one vote, and a small state only had one vote. So the votes were equal but unequal given the sizes of the states. Another reason was that Congress was powerless to levy taxes don't worry about this part. Congress was powerless to levy taxes. They could not raise taxes. They could not lower taxes. The states ran their own taxes at this time. Congress was powerless to regulate commerce. Commerce is just another word for trade. So Congress had nothing to do with the trade. The states had all the power when it came to regulating the trade and how trade happened between the states. There was no executive power to enforce the acts of Congress. So that was a problem. Even though Congress said these are the rules, there was no actual power to make the states agree and follow those rules. They just said they would. There was no national court system. There were only state court systems. If you wanted to make an amendment or a change to the Articles, it required the consent of all states. So all 13 states had to agree to that change or the change couldn't happen. If you wanted to pass a law, 9 of the 13 states had to agree, had to be in the majority for that law to pass. So that sometimes made getting laws passed impossible if you couldn't get at least 9 states to agree. So that was the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. This is going to discuss now the problems with the Articles. So that's your new heading, problems with the Articles. So after the end of the Revolutionary War, states stopped cooperating. So the states stopped cooperating with each other and with the national government, being Congress. After the war was over, the states kind of felt like, hey, we don't have to work together. We don't have to agree to do this stuff anymore because we're no longer in the war. So what are some of the problems? The states refused to supply troops or money. Some states would make their own treaties with other countries or other nations without getting any consent from Congress. And another problem was that the states began to raise their own military forces. Sorry, I messed up here a little bit. There we go. They began to raise their own military forces, which became a problem because if North Carolina had a military force and Virginia had a military force and Maryland had a military force, then what was the point? They were fighting each other, and that was what the leaders in Congress did not want, but that is what was starting to happen after the war ended. Some other problems what the states created with the Articles is that they would tax goods from other states, and they could ban trade with some states. So if Virginia didn't like Maryland, they could say, we're not going to, nobody in Virginia is allowed to trade with anybody from Maryland, which made the trade of goods and the taxing of goods unfair. So it's starting to go back to the way Britain was taxing the states, and they felt that was unfair. So kind of the same things beginning to happen between the states now that the war is over. They also began to print their own money, each state. Why is that a problem? Well, if I have money in Virginia, I can't spend it in Maryland. I can't spend it in Georgia. I can only spend Virginia money in Virginia. There was no national money system, so that created, obviously, a problem. All right, so problems with the Articles continued. No new heading, same heading. So back to the money. The economies of many states struggled as a result of all the bickering and poor planning. So really all we need to know in that sentence is that the economies of many states struggled. The problem was that the newly printed money was worth very little. Prices soared. Loans became hard to get. Many people fell into debt. This led to an economic crisis, which caused a rebellion, and that is known as Shays Rebellion, and that happened in Massachusetts. You can abbreviate Massachusetts as MA. So what was Shays Rebellion? Shays Rebellion was where indebted farmers, so farmers in debt, and other small property owners lost land and possessions because they could not pay their debts or their state taxes. This slide talks a little bit about Shays Rebellion. It was named after Daniel Shays. He led the armed uprising of farmers. State troops eventually ended the rebellion after the rebels attacked state courts and federal arsenals. Daniel Shays fled to Vermont. So you don't really need to know that. That's just kind of extra information. You just need to know that the economic crisis led to Shays Rebellion. And that is the end. Check back for part 2.